What or who do you think of when I say God? Maybe you envision someone or something. Maybe God to you has certain features or clothes or even certain mannerisms. And when you think of God, where do you imagine God is? Is God robed in righteousness in heaven with clouds and St. Peter and cute little cherubs? Or is God down here with you? Is God perhaps with the suffering and those who find themselves cast out of society's order? Well, Job 38, what we're going to study today, uniquely reveals the image and character of God. We come face to face with God's character while also seeing how those in Job's lives value a world created by a just God. But what happens when our assumptions about God don't line up with the way that the world seems to be? What happens when our whole lives are based around the familiar and the secure, only to have it collapse in front of our eyes? And when you find yourself confronting the unknown, what do you do to ease your fears? In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr, urges us to realize that, quote, the familiar and the habitual are so falsely reassuring, and most of us make our homes there permanently. So what happens when we wake up one day and we realize that the God we needed 10 years ago is no longer the God we look to today? How do we cope when our world begins to unravel right in front of us? Do we double down on what we know, cling to the secure? Or perhaps we find our God-given inner strength and move into the unfamiliar, knowing that God longs for us to see beyond the familiar and the reassuring. What if God is calling us away from the familiar and into something else? Because that's where you'll see God most clearly. What if it's simply sitting with God, unsure of anything else, but still knowing that God has never left you? Now, for those of you who aren't actively reading Job, I wanted to offer just a very basic recap. We're going to hit just the basic points. We're not going to go into too much detail or else we'd be here for 3 days. So we're going to go over chapters 1 through 37. It's going to be a bird's eye view. Now, in chapter 1, verse 1, we meet a guy named, you guessed it, Job. See, it's not that hard. You're going to have fun. I promise. Now, the NRSV translation tells us that Job is, quote, blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Job is such a blameless guy, in fact, that he offers sacrifices for any offenses his children may have committed. Not that he knows that they've done these things, it's just, he's not 100% sure. Kids. Now, Job, we're told, has 7 sons and 3 daughters, a wife, land, and a whole gaggle of animals. And what we're to take away from this is that, according to ancient Near Eastern society, Job has been blessed. Although I would argue in today's society, we would see those people as having at least been lucky, maybe even blessed. Now, continuing in chapter 1, verse 6, we see that the, quote, heavenly beings present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser is present as well. Now, some Bibles will have a heading with the phrase attack on Job's character, and God says, I'm going to paraphrase here, look at my servant Job. He's so blameless. He's upright. He's a good guy. You get the idea. And then Hasatan replies, and again, I'm going to paraphrase, of course Job is faithful to you. Nothing bad has ever happened to him. Why wouldn't he be faithful? Let me shake him up a little bit, see what happens, which God allows. Now, in chapter 2, verse 11, we're introduced to Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And the folks over at the Bible Project tell us that Job's 3 friends are supposed to represent, quote, the best of ancient Near Eastern thought. And beginning in chapter 3 and lasting all the way to chapter 37, which is usually where people close their Bibles and say, I'll just wait for the movie, we have Job and his 3 friends debating about Job's suffering. And these all correspond to the questions regarding God's character. Throughout these cycles of debate between Job and his 3 friends, we see the formation of 3 questions circling in the background. Now, these questions are, 1, is God just? 2, is the world God created truly a world where justice can be experienced? And 3, if Job is truly righteous, and if God is indeed a just God, how will Job's suffering be explained? Now, spoiler alert, it won't be explained. In fact, you're actually going to have more questions than answers. But I would argue, as readers of the book of Job and the Bible in general, that's how we're supposed to deal with these concepts. Now, in order to not have a 2-hour sermon, we're going to spend most of our time, but not all of our time, looking into question 3. As we progress from the start of Job until now, and having spent 34 chapters discussing it, we've heard Job and his friends argue about why this sudden tragedy has befallen him. Why has Job lost his family, his lands, his fortune, his good life? Keeping in mind that we aren't aware of what happened between God and Hasatan. Only we as readers are given this insight. And so, the question lingers, what is it, Job's friends wonder, he's done to anger God? Why are these bad things happening to Job? But first, we need to take a look at the view of Job and in view of God, relevance to the time and place of the book. Now, while we don't know who exactly wrote Job or when they wrote it, we are given one important detail. If we look all the way back to chapter 1, we'll see that Job is described as coming from a place called Uz, and you spell that U-Z. I have horrible handwriting, please forgive me. U-Z is how you spell Uz. Now, while we can't completely identify where Uz is, it's probably safe to say that it's located somewhere in the Syrian desert. Which means that Job would most likely not have been an Israelite. Which also means that the concept of God would be different to Job than to, say, someone hailing from someone hailing from Israel. Now, why is this important? Why should you care? Well, because to someone like Job, living in the ancient Near East, the concept of God, or rather, gods, lowercase g and plural, would be that they were capricious and easily angered. And at the very least, when you were bad, it would incite the displeasure of the gods. Job would be familiar with the idea that you were constantly having to keep the gods happy, so that in turn the gods would provide rain and crops and food and children and the whole circle of life thing. Which is why the back and forth narrative between Job and his three friends is actually such a crucial factor. It shows how Job sees God as a God, remember, lowercase g, who needs to be placated, kept happy, with sacrifices and gifts. Good behavior, to satiate God's anger. Kind of like how children are told that in order to have ice cream before you go to bed, you're going to have to do something good first. Clean your room, call grandma, finish your homework, something like that. Yeah? Sound familiar? So, I don't know about you guys, but the last few decades have been rough. You can turn on the news or look in your phone, and you see school shootings. Personal rights endowed by our Constitution are taken away by some of our, from some of our members of society. We've had a pandemic not too long ago. We've had suicides, and there's rising food, gas, housing prices. We've had imperfect policies and legislature. The very people whose job it is to protect and care for the impoverished, the immigrant, the elderly, the isolated, the marginalized members of our society, these people whose job it is to protect them have seemingly turned their backs on them. Even some of our own spiritual shepherds are revealing how they've mistreated and abused members of their own congregation. So again, what does God look like to you? Why do bad things happen to us? But before you answer, consider this. Out of the raging storm, the Eternal One answered Job. Out of the raging storm, God answered Job. When we cry out, God answers us. Now, granted, it may not be the answer that we asked for. It may not be in the ballpark that we asked for. But God is here with us. God isn't somewhere far off, unaffected by human suffering. God isn't in God's heavenly throne room, God's head turned away from humanity. While we may imagine God talking to the adversary in the heavenly throne room with angels and divine counsel and perfection, consider this. It's never explicitly explained where God is when God is talking to the adversary. So, is God far away from Job? Is God beside Job? Is God, up in heaven somewhere? I think as part of being humans, we ask things like, why do bad things happen? Or why did this particular bad thing happen to me? And I think that's natural. But as my job today looking into Job 38, I think the best and most honest answer I can give you in response to that question is, I don't know why bad things happen. I really wish I did, I swear. But I do believe that humans allow indifference to fester. In preparation for today, I looked at several different Bible translations and various commentaries to see if I could figure out what Job 38, chapter 1 was saying. And every translation I looked at said something to the effect that God was in the whirlwind, that God was in the struggle with Job. God emerges from the whirlwind, not the lofty, heavenly, impenetrable throne of God. And it seems to me that God was, and is, struggling with us during our whirlwinds. It's up to us to help each other during our whirlwinds. God emerges from the whirlwind, hair frazzled, clothes torn, maybe a little bit befuddled. And God emerges from the whirlwind and he makes a beeline to Job. When we begin to draw circles on the floor, stand in one, put God in the other, this limits our view of God. We can only see God through one lens at this point. We put God in a box, and then we expect God to play by our rules. But what if the point isn't, why do bad things happen? What if the point instead is, God is struggling with us? Perhaps it's hard for us to see through the fog of human emotion. Over the last 15 years or so, I've come to fully believe that God isn't a hard-lined disciplinarian of a parent who demands that we act appropriately so that we'll be allowed to have ice cream after dinner. If you've been worshiping with us throughout the summer, you may remember Pastor Zach talking about the definition of normal and how it's almost always defined by society. And while, yes, there are a few things that God requires of us, being normal isn't one of them. In fact, I fully believe that God requires us to rock the boat, especially when it helps to bring attention to how normalcy and certain societal practices may limit or even harm certain members of society. You may be familiar with John Lewis, who later became famous Senator John Lewis. He made famous the idea that people should get into good trouble in order to achieve change. God doesn't want our sacrifices, especially if they don't mean anything or they're just for show. Because God isn't the self-centered, arrogant gods of Uz who only like us when we're good, we're not rocking the boat too much, we're not making too much noise, and we're offering sweet-smelling sacrifices to them. The prophet Amos, who writes to Israel during a time of deep-rooted nationwide injustice and idolatry, says to Israel, though I'd argue this could be applied anywhere and any time, the prophet Amos says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. God isn't waiting for us to grow out of our awkward teenage phase and into something more desirable. God is here and now and is getting dirty with us. It may just be that sometimes we're too wrapped up in our own chaos to see much else. What if the point is, bad things may happen to you in your lifetime. And there'll probably be times when you struggle. You can't avoid whatever it is that riles you up or makes you sad. I'd actually argue that you shouldn't avoid those things. Dissect those feelings. Figure out what they mean. Sit with them. Ask them questions. Venture beyond the safety of the here and now and into the unknown. Theologian D. Danielle Thomas states, "Discomfort is the most fertile soil that you'll ever experience in your life." What if God is simply saying, let go of your insecurity, or your certainty, I'm in the unexpected.